It is the 11 Dubcast. I'm Johnny. He's George. We did it. A successful first weekend of college football. We have survived. We have made it through. I had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun watching Ohio State just annihilate Akron. Maybe not the destruction I guess some people were hoping for, especially in the second half or first half rather. But we'll talk about that.
It was more of an annihilation deferred.
Okay. So just put it on back order, just like said, okay, in the future, Akron, when you come in, we're putting up 80. Like that's
as we alluded to with the ridiculousness of a 50-point spread, when it's 17-3 at the half, that's not exactly what you were anticipating.
Are you just mad that they didn't cover? Is that the situation?
No, because I said last week it's ridiculous to expect any team to cover a 50-point spread. Now it didn't do any kindness to my scoring prediction, even though I was one of the 4 closest at 11 Warriors this past week. And, that's not something all of us can say, right, Johnny? But, if it weren't
for a random carom off a dude's head, I would have been second. And that's not, we really shouldn't even count that touchdown. I don't think that's fair. That's all I'm going to say about that. I think I had a perfectly acceptable prediction, and I don't know. Let's, you know what?
Well, we learned last season that Dubcast knows ball.
Yes,
and if only half of the Dubcast still knows ball this season, I think that's still okay for our prospects.
Fair enough. All right, let's talk about the game, because the game was fun and interesting, and I think a lot of cool things happened. Basically, the way I wanted to break this down, things we liked, things we didn't like. We'll start with the positive, right? We'll accentuate the positive to begin with. I think the interesting thing about this, obviously, is that, and I think Chris said it really well. It was either in Slack or on one of our, I think maybe like one of our prediction pieces or things like that. But he was like, these early season out of conference games against like MAC opponents and stuff suck unless they are the opening game of the season, right? Because that's when you actually like, oh, it's something new. It's something that we're learning. It's something that we're seeing for the first time. And Will Howard at quarterback for Ohio State was the first time that we had seen that. We were like, oh my gosh, what's this dude going to do? We're going to see him do a lot of designed runs. He did break off a couple runs, just to, I think, keep the defense honest. It doesn't seem like there were a lot of planned stuff, but I do want to start with him. I think as far as the quarterback situation goes, is he as talented a passer as Kyle McCord? I don't think so. But he is clearly a leader on that team. He is super confident in the pocket. I mean, the guy was just like shaking off defenders and running out of tackles and stuff like that. He's not a guy who's just going to stand back there like a statue. Talent-wise, like I said, arm talent-wise, I don't think he's elite. But in terms of leadership and all those other intangibles that you want to kind of see Ohio State get over the top with, that I did see. And, we'll get into some of the dumb stuff that he did in a bit. But I thought it was a pretty good debut from Ohio State's new quarterback.
Well, I'm not totally convinced that the gap between like in-pocket arm talent yet is as wide as maybe these most 2 recent performances, because Kyle McCord, at least according to Syracuse's head coach, had a weekend worthy of the guy sending Ryan Day a bottle of champagne for casting off Mr.
Right,
McCord from Columbus. That being said, I think that this game showed you why Will Howard is a more valuable quarterback than a quarterback like Kyle McCord is. It was rejuvenating, frankly, to see an Ohio State quarterback actually attempt to run the ball in improvised fashion and designed fashion, which is not something that we've had since. I mean, even Justin Fields wasn't really a run. He would hardly ever run the ball except for when the Buckeyes got into the red zone. And of course, C.J. Stroud infamously, until the very end of his Ohio State career, had his own reputation for not necessarily running the ball. So having a quarterback that actively provides that threat is one thing, just in terms of keeping the defense honest. But we also, one of the most impressive completions that Will Howard had on the day was on a designed rollout to the right where he had 3 levels of options, and he went for the riskiest one of the bunch, the furthest one down the field, and had one of his best throws of the day,
also
moving on the run to the right.
And also a beautifully designed play too. That was, I mean, that was pure like.
But that is not. But not only were people saying Kyle McCord gets sacked in the backfield on that like sort of play action design last year, that's not even a play that you're able to run with Kyle McCord last year, because he was the kind of quarterback that would need to like roll out and then reset his feet and then distribute.
Right.
Wouldn't be able to just make a throw moving at that angle, which is difficult for a defense to defend against if the quarterback is at least accurate. So I still am concerned is a strong word, as I've said before. I'm still waiting to see what kind of ability beyond attacking the sticks or just beyond that Howard has, because he was only 1 for 3 throwing beyond 20 yards in this game. And It's not like Akron was going to give you the best look you're going to see all season relative to downfield defense.
Right.
And the one completion he did have, Jeremiah Smith had to haul it in with one hand. I don't know whether you want to consider that a bailout or not, but there's still more versatility, not just in the plays themselves and their outcomes that Howard demonstrated in just this game than what Ohio State had from its quarterback last season, but also, again, in terms of evaluating that statement about arm talent, there are things that Will Howard did with his arm in this game that I don't think Kyle McCord would have been able to do last season. And while he may not be the pure passer that McCord is, there's still greater versatility that you're getting from that skill set that goes beyond just downfield running. It's just the ability to be mobile, particularly for the size that Howard is, that is going to be valuable for extending plays, which was not something Ohio State was able to do very successfully last season, regardless of what the situation with the offensive line relative to the pass rush was. So I think all of those factors speak very, very well to the game that Howard had and his potential to succeed in this offense going forward. And there's still things that we need to take time to evaluate and notice. But overall, it was an encouraging performance given the circumstances for the debut of the new Ohio State quarterback.
Yeah, and I'm just really excited to see when they do fully kind of weaponize the rushing game with him, and Chip Kelly decides to get a little creative. And obviously for these first few games, he's not going to put everything out there on the field, right? Like this was a super, super vanilla game in terms of what they were presenting and what they were doing. And that's obviously by design. Like they're not going to come out and do everything that they, put all their cards on the table, try to make people understand exactly what their offensive approach is with Will Howard. I think there's going to be a lot more in terms of like designed runs and whatnot as you go through the season, but there's no reason to get this guy banged up against Western Michigan and Akron and so on. But yeah, I thought it was really encouraging. I thought he performed really well. He's got great leadership. Everybody was locked in. I think it's really cool. I mean, this is the second thing I want to talk about. People have been hyping up Jeremiah Smith basically since he got on campus and just saying how this guy is like unbelievably polished.
And I've been telling people to measure their expectations, and then he goes out and he drops his first target.
That's right. He's terrible. I love Chris Carter immediately tweeting. He was like, hey, Buckeye Legends doing the same thing, because that's apparently what Chris Carter did on his first pass, his first target.
We all remember Chris Carter doing that, right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. It's fond memories from when I was 1, I think. When you did not exist. But yeah, I mean, it was pretty hilarious. Probably the best way that could have started. But then he comes out and he has an unbelievable game. The fade that he caught there for a touchdown, I mean, just where he contorts his body, reminded me of every other like really incredible wide receiver that you've seen at Ohio State over the past 5 or 6 years. Like that play, I feel like I've seen from, like Devin Smith on, really, like all the way, past 10 years, really, where you see a guy target, contort his body, catch it, protect. I mean, it's just, it almost feels textbooks at this point, but obviously the athleticism involved is just supernatural. He had that really, really long pass catch. I forget how many yards it was, like 40 some yards, something like that. So, he was fantastic in that element, 2 touchdowns total. I don't think you can ask much more from a debut. He's the leading receiver for the team. He was as advertised, and teams are going to really have to spend a lot of resources to keep that guy in check, which is great for a guy like Emeka Egbuka, who also had a pretty good game. He's essentially, I think, their designated slot guy, basically, and so he's not going to have those big, crazy pop-off numbers sometimes. But, I thought in general, like, the wide receivers looked really, really solid. Even, some of the guys that you don't normally think about, because you've got all these other, dudes around. But, like, Carnell Tate had a good game. Like, he was actually the second leading receiver on the team. So, I don't know. I thought it was pretty good top to bottom from the wide receivers, and a really great debut for Jeremiah Smith.
Yeah. I don't think I have that much more to add onto that than what you just said.
Do you think, a lot of people have been saying, like, oh, this is, he's even better than Marvin or whatever. I don't know that you can even really, like, I don't think you can quantify any of that at this point. I think the hype needs to back down a little bit.
I still remember the first full game Marvin Harrison Jr. played. He caught 3 touchdown passes, and Smith only had 2. And
then there you go.
Marv, that was in the Rose Bowl against Utah, and this was against Akron. So
apparently, the true freshman touchdown record, I think we were discussing this, is 8. So that's going to be gone by the end of September, I got to believe.
I would think so, based on the fact that it already seems like Smith is their featured guy.
And it just feels like Howard has a really good rapport with him, which is really cool. Like, I like the fact that you don't have to worry about, who's established and who isn't. It's just who's open. And, I think Will Howard's just like, screw it. Let's get dudes the ball. So I really like that a lot. Running back wise, I really enjoyed what I saw out of there. Look, Travion Henderson, when he's healthy, is one of the best running backs in the country. I think we've known that for a while. He was showing that every time he got the rock. He was just, fast and making decisive cuts. I think he averaged something like 8 yards a carry. Quinshon Judkins is who he is. I remain a bit of a skeptic on that dude. But he also is one of those guys who just wears down the defenses. And I think if you need 4 yards, he's going to get you that 4 or 5 yards. And that's still really, really valuable. He fell forward on every carry that he had. He isn't a guy who's going to get caught in the backfield, like tiptoeing around or anything like that. Like, he's aggressive. He attacks. And I think when you have that combination with Henderson, who's really deadly on the edge, that really keeps defenses on their toes. So both of those guys combined, a lot of people are predicting, like, you're going to have 2,000-yard rushers. I don't see that happening, honestly. I think the way they're going to, like, allocate, rushing yards and how they want to play offense, I don't see that happening. And you may not even see one 1,000-yard rusher on this team this season. But that's not going to be because they're bad or because they're not living up to expectations. It's just going to be by design. So I don't know. I liked what I saw out of there too. I thought it was pretty great. And then that block Trey had, where it was probably the most excited I've ever seen him on a football field, where he just laid that dude out. They're back, man. They're ready to play.
Judkins had a great block too on one of the designed runs that Will Howard had on a QB power. So it's encouraging to see both of them be able to block well, because that'll, it won't necessarily make it obvious when the passing downs are coming if both of those guys are able to, pick up defenders reliably and not just kind of get blown over. It's interesting. I think that's one of the criticisms people had of Dallin Hayden last year. And then we saw him used he got complimented for his blocking during Colorado's game against North Dakota State last week. So that was kind of interesting.
Right.
Also matched his reception total from last season in one game with Colorado.
Yeah.
So.
Shout out, by the way, to Carlos Lachlan, new running backs coach, because I got to believe that his influence is kind of, his fingerprints as a coach are all over that, where they're
I would think so,
dudes, because that's the kind of guy he is. He's a hype guy. He wants them to get aggressive and into it.
But I think ever since, Urban Meyer was always someone that really stressed being able to have that pass blocking ability, and that was something that I think gave Ohio State running backs a lot of utility in the NFL. That's what like allowed a lot of those players to kind of like break into that next level. And even if they didn't necessarily get drafted, they would just kind of be on rosters because they proved that they had some kind of pass blocking capability. I mean, that was something that Zeke, like that was one of the reasons he was a top 5 pick, was because it was like this guy's coming into the NFL right now, and he might be the best pass blocking running back in the league already, like even just coming straight out of college. So I think that has kind of set the standard for Ohio State running backs as blockers going all the way, that's almost like 10 years ago at this point. So I, in terms of like, we take a lot of things for granted as Buckeye fans. That's kind of one of the things I've written off too, in the same way. It's like, oh, the receiver room's going to be deep every year. I expect pretty much every running back to be a reliable blocker just because it's kind of been ingrained with the culture at this point.
Mm-hmm.
What I would say, I came away impressed with Will Howard, but I would still say just aesthetically, I was most impressed with Travion Henderson, even though I should already know who that guy is at this point. I mean, he had one of the most prolific rushing performances in Ohio State history as a freshman. And, he's coming in. This is his first game of the season. We would hope that he's healthy. He hasn't picked up anything in practice. But the speed of his cuts was really what impressed me just crazy. The most. It was like the thing that just kind of got my eyes to open the most out of anything that I saw offensively this past week. And it makes me feel good knowing that Judkins is there, because if a guy like that wasn't, available to handle 5 more carries than Henderson did, I don't know if you're in a situation where you can have Henderson handle less than 10 touches on the ground and still lead the team in rushing. I mean, if I have no problem with giving Judkins 5 more touches a game than Henderson if it means keeping him in a role where he's able to average 8 yards per tote or per just touch generally, because he had 2 receptions for 18 yards in this game too. So he finished with over 80 total yards on 10 touches, even though he didn't score. I just came away very encouraged that, what that guy's going to look like if he stays healthy. Now, I will say, I think most people were expecting a much more run-heavy game plan against an opponent like this. It's part of the reason why I said last week when you asked me, what would you set the rushing yard total at, or the line for? I was like, I'm going to go with 350. And I know that's a lot, but I think they can pull that off. Of course, they only got fine.
They were only
they didn't even get half of that. They only got 170. So, but I would have expected in a game that ends 52-6. Granted, there's 2 defensive touchdowns, but you would still expect in a blowout of that caliber that they would have elected to run the ball more. And they kept things more even and honest, which I think is encouraging, but it also speaks to, I think, something you said earlier, which is they're not necessarily wanting to reveal their whole hand. I wonder how much more run heavy their game plan is going to be against more sophisticated opponents. Maybe Donovan Jackson's absence also played into that, because I know that not having your best player on the line probably explains some of the communication issues that some people saw and that people we know on 11 Warriors staff were pointing out during the game in terms of the offensive line being a little bit underwhelming in certain situations. But I overall, I came away we talked about how interesting it was going to be relative to what the split between Henderson and Judkins was going to be. And I think that even if my expectations in terms of their overall offensive involvement were not aligned with what actually ended up playing out, our inquisitiveness in terms of what is that distribution going to look like, I think was, justified and vindicated in terms of the split that we were going to kind of expect. And we did we did see Judkins featured a little more, even though I think Henderson started the first drive, and they eventually started to blend the two together as opposed to giving them like a drive for drive situation.
I do think that split is probably along the lines of what we'll see going forward, right? Like where you've got a guy who's kind of your fire plug dude who's going to be in there, he'll take the hits, whatever, and then you've got your flash guy who's going to come in and really just kind of like change tempo and things like that. And that's fine.
Let the guy who's used to handling almost 30 carries per game based on the last couple of seasons at another program handle 5 more carries per game than your home run hitter and keep
I think that's
fresh.
And I'm totally cool with that. I think that's a good way for them to approach it going forward. Last thing I want to say in terms of like positives. Well, actually, we didn't really even talk about the defense. I do want to say defense is just as advertised. Secondary looks unbelievable. I know they were without Cody Simon. That kind of sucks, but I still think they were really, really good there. The interior, the defensive line, I was really like Tyleek. People like, I know obviously Tumaloau and Jack Sawyer are going to get all the pub, and JT had a great game. He was, I think, he had a sack and a half, and then maybe another tackle for loss or something like that. He was all over the place. He was fantastic. But Tyleek Williams does not get the credit that he deserves. He was really, really disruptive. I love what they're doing on the defensive line. They look really, really tough. They look really, really deep. I have zero complaints. I mean, there was, I guess you could say, like with Hicks, possibly like still trying to figure out the position a little bit. But I think he still ended up with like a sack, even though he was out of place sometimes. Caleb Downs is, freaking everywhere.
In the same way that it was, so nice as an Ohio State fan to see a quarterback do things we hadn't seen from that position in a number of years. It was similarly so nice after years of watching Borland and Eichenberg trudge through molasses in the middle of the field to just have somebody with a slightly elevated level of athleticism command that position again. So it was nice to see that from Hicks at the very least.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I mean, the blitzing's going to be a lot of fun to see what they do with those dudes. Downs is all over the place. He was great. I mean, overall, they were as advertised. I mean, Akron really got nothing going. I mean, there were a couple drives where they looked like they were, maybe putting something together, and then that got shut down. They only had
and I did wonder
yards.
how early in the game, like how much they had realistically prepared for seeing an alternative look at quarterback than the starter, because I know there's a lot of situations where you spend so much time prepping for one guy, you're not super rehearsed, and then you end up, you get a different look from somebody with a more versatile skill set that you hadn't prepared for.
Right.
And, that explains why Akron scored first this season and Ohio State didn't. So
but they still handled it really well.
They adapted and they figured it out.
Right.
But they still, for the expectation of this defense, we had several people on staff that were expecting a shutout. I think it just kind of spoke to the fact that you can't anoint any team as world beaters right off the bat. You got to give them time to.
They got to beat the world,
Yeah. Well, prove they can beat the world at least. So I was a little bit concerned just given how that first drive went, but I tried to give them benefit of the doubt relative to prepping for the alternative look. I have to wonder that if Akron, like how much more effective Akron would have been if they hadn't elected to go back to their starter as quickly as they did based on the success that Taj Bullock had, if they hadn't just went right back to Ben Finley. So
the thing is,
I'm a little bit worried about how more mobile quarterbacks are going to give them problems as the season goes on. But that's kind of been the same way that I've felt about Ohio State's defense for a long time now, even before Jim Knowles.
Well, I will say this. If you look at their yards per attempt, it's like it was around 5 for Bullock, less than 4 for Finley. That was the thing. Like, you can do that. And I think that's what Jim Knowles' kind of philosophy is that you keep everything in front of you and you just, get 2 or 3 yards, get 4 yards, get 5. You can't do that consistently against us. We're not going to worry about it, but we're not going to let you go over top. And they had no ability to do that. Like because in part because, you know, it's Akron and they're dealing with that, you know, they don't have that talent, but it's also because you've got those guys on the corners and you've got safeties and you've got all these other dudes who are just not going to let you throw anything longer than like 5 or 6 yards at a time. So I do think that they were a little, you know, caught wrong-footed by that. But ultimately, I don't think it would have mattered just because it's not like one of the guys was utilizing his legs to let him hit bombs. Like that just wasn't happening.
Well, Bullock, he threw one less pass attempt than Finley did, and he actually not only threw for more yards, but he also didn't have any picks. So he played – he had a much more effective day throwing the ball than their original starter did. Granted, Finley was playing injured, but he still was able to keep the defense more honest, and he led them in rushing too. So it's like if you had just, once your guy had gotten hurt, if you had just rolled with the one that got you 3 points on the opening drive, how much more of an effective day would you had, and how much more
instead of keeping your starter in to like
would
break
Ohio
his
State's
ribs?
Defense have looked early on?
Right. Yeah, that would have been a really interesting thing to see. And the fact that they kept in Finley for as long as they did was kind of baffling. Because
I think that was a misguided decision on Akron's part.
For a number of reasons. Because the guy was like injured, clearly. And they're like, all right, go out there, dude. Get sacked 3 more. Yeah, that was rough. I didn't like seeing that. Last thing I want to say about the stuff I was really happy to see, and we'll get in the cons, we'll do it quickly, but punt returns, baby. Let's go. Look, hey, this was obviously a point of emphasis. Ryan Day said it was going to be a point of emphasis. They got rid of the guy that everybody wanted to get rid of.
I was just glad they didn't have a starter back there fair catching these
my
things.
God.
I was like, that's progress enough for me alone.
Brandon Ennis looks really, really good in that role as punt returner. He had 60 punt return yards. Okay. And Josh was telling us, I could not believe this because I had totally forgotten about it. In all of 2023, the Ohio State Buckeye football team had 75 yards of punt returns. And the entirety of last season, they had 75 total yards of punt returns.
It's because Parker Fleming knows how to coach a nice, fair catch.
Right.
You know?
And so in this one game, Brandon Ennis had 60 yards, almost getting the same amount in one game as the entire last season. He looked great. He's going to break one. I am going to say it right now. They're going to get a punt return touchdown at some point this season. He looked really, really good doing that, and I was super stoked to see that. That was kick ass. I loved it. And I gotta look up how long it's been. It's been a minute since they.
On the other side of punts, it was concerning after I had said Nick McLarty is a dark horse to win the Ray Guy Award. That,
yeah, right. And he does.
Apparently, he had a bad week of practice and got benched. So
it sucks going
another
around the
bad
world.
Prediction from yours truly. You
That's
know,
right.
I was full of them last week between 350 team rushing yards. What else did I say? The 50-point cover I'm not as upset with.
No,
I said
that's
that,
what Vegas said. So.
I said, oh, you know what? I said Akron wasn't going to make it past the 50. That was the bad defensive prediction that I had, and that got blown up on the first drive.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think Ben Finley would have made it past the 50. If Taj Bullock had never played, you know, maybe that ends up holding true. But between those two things and McLarty, it's not a great week of predictions.
Yeah,
but my scoring prediction was okay at least.
Couple cons that I had, a couple downsides that I saw. The offensive line is still a little bit of a work in progress. We did mention obviously you're missing probably your best offensive lineman, which is going to impact any that unit against anybody. I don't care whether it's Akron or not. And again, a work in progress doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that I think they have to figure some things out in terms of how they work together. And again, you don't have this statue, that you're playing in front of. You have a guy who's going to be a little bit more mobile. Not only does that impact how they play, but also it means that they've just got to figure out protections and all that kind of stuff. I think they'll get better. And I think they'll get better once, Jackson comes back. Will Howard, as much as I liked a lot of what I saw from Will Howard is still Will Howard, right? Like we know that this guy is prone to some dumb turnovers or making a bad decision or two. Like I don't think anybody should think that this guy is like Mr. Perfect. And that attempted pass to Travion Henderson that ended up being, basically a backwards lateral, it almost turned the ball over. I don't think that's a one-off. I think you're going to see more of that kind of stuff because he's a guy who tries to make stuff happen. And I think sometimes he just says the hell with it and does not err on the side of caution. And that's going to, like, it's okay when you're playing Akron or when you know when to pick your poison against certain teams or in certain situations. But I do think there is a threat that that kind of thing happens at a critical moment in a game where you cannot be doing that. And so that's something that is going to have to continue to try to improve upon, because I don't think that's just, like I said, something that, oh, well, that was sucked and I'll never do it again. I think that's still kind of part of who he is. And that's what you got to accept when you have him, transferred to your school.
I think based on how his career has gone, it's usually more of an issue in the first half of the season, and then he starts to settle in a bit. Part of the reason, I said Akron would get a field goal last week, and I allotted them that because even though I said they weren't going to make it past the 50, because I expected Howard to turn the ball over at least once in Ohio State's own half, because he had I
expected a turnover too, honestly.
In the first 5 games for Kansas State last season, he turned the ball over at least once or he threw a pick in each of those games.
Yeah.
So I expected there to be just a little bit of growing pains with Howard settling in, despite the fact that I don't really think, based on the talent that Ohio State has, that Howard's going to need to do anything more than be a glorified game manager.
He just needs to distribute. He doesn't need to. Yeah, he doesn't have to go out there and try to win games by himself.
Was that Greg McElroy? I think at Bama. That's kind of what I remember.
I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. You want a championship?
He used to get filleted by ESPN commentary for look at how McElroy hands the ball
Stands
off,
in the pocket.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like that's it. So I don't know how much more Howard is going to need to do with this. So yeah, I don't need to see him going out of his way to make plays like what almost led to the turnover with the effective lateral to Henderson, hopefully. But I would assume, especially as the level of competition ramps up, that he is less encouraged to take risks like that.
Yeah.
And I trust that the level of experience he has, combined with the fact that this is easily the most talent he's ever played around in his football career, is going to more often than not keep him from making mistakes that could be construed as disastrous. Right. I don't expect him to commit any turnover as damning as the one that McCord had to open the Michigan game last year.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, you can be like, oh, well, Howard might turn the ball over. It's like, all right, well, is he going to throw a pick like immediately to Michigan in the first series of the game? Like, if he doesn't do that, I'll be okay.
That's the floor.
Yeah, right.
It's
exactly.
Pretty simple, I think, to come out ahead of that.
Yeah. Last thing, they got I don't think Devin Brown's it at backup. I think you got to get Julian Sand in there, get him as many reps as possible, because he went in there, he looked shaky. He only attempted 3 passes, so I mean, maybe that's not fair, but I have very little confidence in that guy. And I don't know. From everything they're saying about Sand and his arm talent, I think that's what they have to roll with. So anytime, you have a blowout like this, you're putting in the backups, I really think Julian Sand's got to be the dude throwing the rock in that situation.
Yeah, we've been saying it all season. I mean, or all off season rather. Sand's got the higher ceiling. Brown, I think, more closely replicates Howard's skill set right now than what Sand can.
Sure, yeah.
And based on what we saw in the spring game, Sand is still green enough that he's probably more prone to forcing it and making compromising mistakes than Brown is. It's just that in terms of the ability to get the most out of everybody else in the offense, I think it's pretty clear at this point that Sand's potential for doing that is greater than what Brown has. So yeah. I would like to see that too. Hopefully it's really a non-issue just because Howard's health holds up, but that's going to be an interesting conversation if it does get to that point in terms of what team is going to realistically give Ohio, or which quarterback rather is going to give this team the most, like, the best look to still satisfy the goals that it had under Howard if he's not available. Because I don't think this was a damning relief I mean, what performance in relief really is, but
yeah, right.
It was just more vindicating for people that have been singing that tune all season. Like, this isn't the guy, like, for this team long term, which I think is probably. It explains why there were quarterbacks from 2 different programs that looked at the situation in the backfield this past offseason and said, I can go to that school and win that job.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's one thing to have one guy do it, but to have two different Power 5 quarterbacks from two different programs, particularly when one of them is, Alabama, who had a pretty great weekend themselves, to say, I don't need to hang around here because I can give myself an opportunity to go get the starting job at Ohio State. I think it says something about the talent that they had available prior to the arrival of those two in the transfer portal. So.
Yeah, agree. Well, I thought it was a pretty good game. It was exciting to see Ohio State football back in action.
I would say acceptable.
Yeah,
I'm not going to go as far as to say, like, this is the only good time to see Ohio State play a MAC team is when it's the first game of the season. There's never a good time. There's never a good time.
That's true. You don't. I mean,
I don't expect a great time in the next game either, which we'll talk about at the end of the show.
There's a limited amount of data, I guess, that you can really glean from it. I mean, that is definitely true. I do like the fact that Ohio State continues its 100-year plus streak of beating all comers from the state of Ohio, so that's pretty good.
I'm just saying, when you're looking forward to a matchup with Iowa as the first time you can actually evaluate your team against a relatively talented other side.
Yeah.
It says something about the non-conference schedule.
Yeah. Ohio State. Yeah. They did not really pack them in this particular offseason. So we'll see how that goes. We'll talk a little bit more about that upcoming game in a second, but we got a couple other things we got to get to. First, of course, is Ask Us Anything. And before we do that, I want to remind you that the Dubcast is sponsored by the dry goods store at 11warriors.com, drygoods.11warriors.com, shirts, hats, stickers, all kinds of cool stuff. Check it out. Let's do Ask Us Anything. We remind you that you can ask us literally anything. By sending us questions to dubcast at 11warriors.com, DUBCAST at 11warriors.com. And let's go ahead, and we got a question here from Jen, and Jen wants to know, this is said, assuming you'll get tons of football questions. So this is a non-football question we'll start with. What is the stupidest thing you've ever bought off of Amazon?
Ooh, see, I deliberately don't shop on Amazon so that I can avoid putting myself in situations like this.
Interesting. Okay.
Oh, but I'm sure I can think of a good answer. You go first, and then I'll try to rattle my history to see if I can think of one.
I tried.
Certainly nothing Zach Smith has ever bought on Amazon.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Nothing along those lines. My biggest problem is I always do this where I tell myself, it's like, okay, if there's an article of clothing, I'm not going to buy it sight unseen. I'm a tall, gangly man, right? Like, I've got long arms and legs, and I'm relatively tall, and nothing fits on me correctly. So if I don't see something, right, then I don't buy it, because I know it's going to look ridiculous on my body. And then it feels like every year or so, I convince myself that that's not actually the case. And one time I bought this shirt that I just it had a cool logo on it or something, and I thought it'd be good. And I was like, well, I got to get an extra large. And it shipped, and it was like a bed sheet. Like, you could literally put it on a dinner table is how large it was. Like, you could stretch it all the way across and just slide it on I'm like, what the hell? And so I was like, fine, whatever, Amazon return policy, whatever. And then I had paid, it was an expensive shirt. It was one of those $25, $30 shirts where it's oh, it's a logo shirt. And, first of all, it did have returns, but it was basically I was going to have to pay almost the same amount of the price as the item. So I was like, this is the dumbest. So out of spite, I still returned it because I was so angry, and I wanted to give myself a reason never to forget that, so I wouldn't make the same stupid mistake again. And from then on, I just refuse to buy clothing items on Amazon because I know it's never going to work out. It's going to look like crap no matter what happens. And there's just so much stuff that's flooded there now that is just low quality. I don't even bother. I don't know, the hell with it. So,
okay. I know what it is. I bought and I know how stupid it was because of how this ended up playing out on Amazon itself. My first place in Miami, I started doing furniture shopping for my apartment that I moved into, and I mostly got all winners. I got a bed that I've since purchased once or twice again, just in terms of the mattress.
Nice.
I got good bed frames both of the times that I've had to buy off of there. I got these like patio chairs that I still use, but the biggest screw up that I had, the only miss I had in that whole process was I bought a sectional off of there. And I spent
those never go well. Sectionals, I don't know what's their curse.
I bought like $1,000 sectional off of there. And I guess I just didn't vet the company enough that was selling it to me, because it was clearly just some it was some Chinese scam.
Sure,
like I got
Did you get a model of a sectional.
It looked functionally it didn't let me down.
Right.
But it was not nearly to the quality of what I paid for. It didn't even come close to matching the pictures from which I bought it. And like after I literally got it in the mail, and then after putting it together, I was like, there's no way that this was up to the standard of what I paid for.
Yeah.
I tried to pull up the listing again to compare it to the pictures from when I bought it, and it had already been delisted.
I feel
so
like
there were
gotta be
enough complaints about this from the time that I purchased it in that 2-week window to get it taken down from Amazon, and I couldn't find the listing again. I'm like, oh, great. Well, I clearly just got scammed. But you know what?
It sucks.
I'll live with it. It is what it is. So
I feel like
don't buy a sectional off of Amazon. But any other furniture, you're probably going to come out all right.
I feel like that's pretty good advice. Anytime I'm like shopping online, I also kind of mentally set like a dollar amount limit. You know what I mean? Because I don't trust any of it. And I'm just, again, I think maybe it's easy to forget that I'm almost a 40-year-old man, but like I don't trust things sight unseen when I'm trying to purchase them. And I know that's not the case for a lot of people who are younger, or even not even that much younger, but I just don't, I can't fathom buying a mattress or a couch or something like that I haven't like sat on.
That is generally how I am too. Which is why I was disappointed with myself when I got this.
But it's an important lesson. You'll never forget that.
I try to avoid this stuff.
Right. You'll never forget that, and that's totally fine.
All my other furniture purchases on Amazon have been totally satisfactory, though. So it was just that one.
Nice.
You gotta.
Okay, well, there you go. You got to take the good with the bad. Then that's good. I'm glad you've had some that have worked out. This next one here is from Tim. Tim wants to know, who is the freshman that you personally were most hyped about prior to the season that maybe other people weren't as excited about? In other words, that you were like
Nick McLarty.
Well, not necessarily this year, like all time, I think is what he's going for here.
Oh,
like,
really?
Yeah. Doesn't okay. I mean, Nick McLarty may still be the answer to that.
No. Not all time. Definitely for this season.
But somebody that, so I think what he's trying to ask is like that other people weren't hyping. So that somebody that you personally were hyped up about that other people weren't like super ecstatic.
That's I mean, it's difficult because anytime a freshman is talented enough to start on a team like Ohio State, they're always garnering.
Well, yeah. But maybe other people, you know what I'm saying? Like there's guys who are like super, super, super hyped versus guys that you're like, oh, I'm excited about, but maybe not other people are talking about as much.
I mean, this might just be selective memory, but I don't feel like Joey Bosa, despite the fact that he was starting as a freshman,
I don't think he
really
he came in
got
with like
the level of hype until like he
not like his brother
put a few starts together.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
But the fact that he was good enough to like start at that age, like, and I was in school when he was, so I was already thinking like, okay, this guy's gonna be like an elite defensive end among the Urban Meyer era. Like I can already just tell based on the fact that he's this good at this age to start in a system of Urban Meyers at Ohio State. Like this is where it's going to be. So, I mean, again, that could just be me ingratiating my own memory, but I don't
think he was as hyped as a guy like Ryan Shazier or like some of these
certainly
other
not his brother either.
No, not as absolutely not nearly as much as Nick. And I think the part of the reason why
Nick's hype was exactly from
because
what
of Joey
accomplished.
Exactly. exactly. And, you know, I thought about Ryan Shazier with it. I know Ryan Shazier like had all the hype in the world and whatnot. And I think in terms of like actual excitement, he was one of the guys that I was like super, super excited about. But I know so many other people felt the same way. The guy that I actually would answer for this question, or have as an answer for this question, did not end up being like a super huge, crazy all-star dude. I mean, he was very good. He was a regular starter on the national championship team. And I think he was a good player, but he wasn't like great. I was just really excited about him because I thought that I had found this dude. You know, I had been following this guy in his recruitment since the beginning, which is rare for me because I usually don't do that. And I had found this guy that nobody else was talking about, and I thought he was going to come out and be like this All-American. And he wasn't that, but he's still a very, you know, like I said, a very good player. But Michael Bennett is a guy that I was unbelievably excited for coming to Ohio State. Mm-hmm. The reason why that was the case is because he started as an offensive lineman in high school. And that's the way he was recruited by most colleges. Only 2 schools told him that he could be a defensive lineman. One of them was Northwestern, and the other one was Ohio State. And that's what his 2 final schools were Northwestern and Ohio State, because he didn't want to be an offensive lineman. He wanted to be a defensive lineman. Everybody else is like, no, this is where we're going to play. And only those 2 schools, Ohio State and Northwestern, were willing to you know, let him try that out. And then, of course, he ends up going to Ohio State. And I was like following practice reports and whatnot. I even went to a couple practices where he was at, and I was like, this guy's like legit. Like, he's fast. He's got really good hands. And of course, like I said, he didn't end up being this like our world dude, but he was a solid contributor, really good player for several years. And I just remember like that was the dude that I kind of fixated on a little bit because I thought he was, you know, he just had a ton of potential, and he was overlooked by most colleges. Another guy like that was Brian Roll, another dude who I followed, you know, since he was in high school, and, you know, undersized. A lot of people probably weren't expecting a lot out of him compared to a lot of the other dudes that were coming in at the time. And he was, again, a very good contributor. He was a guy who played really well for Ohio State. So I really like guys like that. I like guys who come in little unheralded, little disrespected, and they end up having really good Ohio State careers. So that would be my answers for that question. I appreciate that. So great questions this week. Keep sending them in. If you have any questions about Akron, about Western Michigan, anybody else, let us know. We want to talk about it. We want to get into it.
Anything else? Ask us anything.
We're going to talk about the national scene, but before we do that, we both watched the Colonel Connor Stalions. I don't know why I say
Colonel Sanders.
Colonel Sanders documentary. We both watched the Colonel Sanders documentary about sign stealing. No, Connor Stalions.
They were taking their cues from Church's Chicken, and
you know, so watching this,
mired in controversy and sauce.
Yeah, a lot of people said there wasn't a lot new to be had from this, which I agree with. Right? Like, I mean, he said, "Oh, hey, look, check it out. It's the game ball that Harbaugh gave."
I'm disappointed at how upset I allowed it to make me, given how much of this information I already knew.
Yeah. There was very little that was new. I did like the fact that they did the like the Rick James thing where it's like, you know, I would never dig my feet into his couch, and it's like, yeah, I dug my feet into his couch, and like. Yeah, and Connor Stalions,
incredible comparison.
But you know what I'm saying? Like, Connor Stalions, like, no, I didn't do this. That's insane. And then he's like, yeah, of course I gave my friends and family, you know, tickets to go record various football games. Like, why wouldn't they want to see Rutgers and Purdue on their own time? That's just the thing that they do. And they had the Washington Post guy who was like, first of all, I didn't even know Ryan Day went to my school. Secondly, it strains credulity
that speaks to the entire problem that I have with this thing, is that so much of this had deliberately malicious framing in terms of downplaying the seriousness of what took place here.
Right.
Because it's not like when Michigan brought that up, the Michigan people were trying to make it seem like they went to school together. And I could be incorrect about this, but I believe it was actually Ryan Day was like on staff as like a grad assistant or something, while the WAPO reporter was actually a student. So it's like they were
friends.
They did not go to school together. Yeah. They were at the school at the same time in totally different areas.
No, no. But
there's
no
Ryan
Day's brother
outside of that.
But Ryan Day's brother is the guy who they really got it. Like the whole thing is just bonkers, and the fact that they were giving it any legitimacy.
To frame all of the evidence against the Lions as circumstantial, and then put their foot down about that being how his spreadsheet got leaked, is the height of hypocrisy.
No.
That is what made me more upset than anything else, was when they were asserting it was too much of a coincidence for that not to be what took place.
Right.
But then everything else that is damning against the Lions in this story is circumstantial.
Yeah,
how can you sit there with a straight face and claim that?
Well, they couldn't sit there with a straight face, because then when they pulled up the picture of him on the sidelines of Central Michigan, he's like laughing about it, and then of course you've got Portnoy who comes in immediately afterwards. Yeah, he told me
I couldn't. Why did Portnoy say that even?
Because he's an idiot. He's
like,
stupid.
Are they so unabashed in not thinking that anything is going to come out of this that they're just like, yeah, I'll just own it, screw it.
Yes,
and the rest of them are just laughing. It's the point's been made over 100 times already. How it's very funny that Stalions has, as his own father refers to it, a Rain Man sort of like brain relative to remembering all these.
Yes, but can't remember whether or not
he spent several weekends. Taking pictures of in his own in his room, but he can't recall whether he was at this specific game or not. I also enjoy that they literally showed like the film of his meeting with the NCAA, where it's just very obvious he's reading off answers that his lawyers wrote him as they slide the notepad to and from him in the middle of the hearing. Like it's that's totally what an innocent person does, right? Is just read from a script that their lawyers have written for them.
Yeah. It was, I mean, it was stupid. It was, obviously just slanted to get Connor's involvement. I mean, that was pretty much what they were going for. And like we said, there wasn't really anything new that was revealed by it. I think the idea that Michigan coaches didn't really understand what was going on, and they were just like, oh, this is totally fine. That is hard. That is harder for me to believe now, because this guy wasn't he wasn't an intern. He wasn't a guy that people saw on the weekends and he's just like watching film or something. I mean, this is a guy who seems pretty heavily enmeshed in Michigan's culture by that point. And I don't know, to me, it kind of like, I don't know how you can make the argument that he was just some dude that nobody knew. And he was just like finding out, all this information in ways that nobody else, understood. Like, that doesn't seem likely to me.
I was disappointed with a lot of the journalists in this. Like, I thought it was really interesting that they didn't even allude to the fact at all that Nicole Auerbach is a Michigan alum. Like that they didn't include that in her intro or anything. And most of the journalists outside of the one from Yahoo Sports, Dan Wetzel, he I think went to UMass Amherst. He doesn't have really any Michigan ties. The WAPO.
No, but he's in the Northeast, so which means he knows Ryan Day intimately. They're best friends, and so obviously.
Well, no, but he's not the WAPO.
No, I know.
And that guy doesn't have ties either. But they didn't even. I mean, Portnoy didn't really like. I mean, he kind of made it pretty obvious he was tied at the hip to Michigan, but they didn't even bring up the fact that Portnoy was a Michigan alum in this either, which I thought was. I feel like it's kind of dishonest to not mention how much, how many Michigan alums you're interviewing relative to the journalism components of this story. But what I loved, my favorite moment from this whole thing, was the very end, the last bit that they got from the guy that works at the Detroit Free Press, where he very just flatly outstated that the myth of the Michigan man, the holier than thou Michigan man after this scandal is total BS.
Right.
From the words of the in-state, I mean, for a guy that lives and works out of that state.
Now, he could be a Michigan State guy. He could be a Michigan State guy.
Could be, but as he even alluded to himself in that, he said the two biggest beats that we have relative to football at this paper are Detroit Lions, Michigan football. Everything else takes a back seat. Right. To make that acknowledgement at the beginning of this and then at the end blast your second biggest audience on the football beat as saying the myth of your holier than thou figure is complete bull, I thought was so great.
That was fun.
So
that was
I can't remember that guy's name, but my big ups to that guy for making that strong of a statement, because I think that's very damning for just where this entire story sits in the lore of this.
Shout out to Bro Ohio for rolling in looking like the Unabomber. I will say though, dude, I feel for you, man. I understand the desire for internet anonymity. I also feel really bad that lasted about 3 seconds after your involvement with this. That sucks. We've
in
had
the same way that Stalions couldn't recall being at the Central Michigan game, but he could recall 3,000 separate signals. It was very funny that Michigan fans went out of their way to dox this guy who was in a ski mask and sunglasses and otherwise gave off nothing relative to his identity. But they can't identify Stalions in a similar sunglass.
There's no way we can tell who this is. Yeah, and what really bothered me is like people were making fun of this dude afterwards, like, God, this guy, I can't believe he's going through. And then of course it became completely justified by the fact that people went and tried to dox him immediately after this came out.
It was quite funny watching people like Nicole Arbach have to admit that, like, for all the grief that we give the message board people, they were out in front of this before we were. Like, we had to report everything that they were saying, even though we had to go verify it from other sources. They figured it out before we did.
Yeah. So shout out to all those people who are on top of it. We want to make sure that, again, I don't want to I don't want to participate in doxing somebody or putting somebody's name out there who doesn't want to be identified. I just want to say, like, hey man, that sucks. And, I hope it everything stays like low key for you as
if the hammer does come down on Michigan, though, I think that it's going to be just so incredible that 11 Warriors, even if it wasn't the staff, played a leading role in unearthing the scandal and wrongs that took place in this story here. And Brohio gets a lot of credit for that, but just to have like this place be the one of the lead responsibilities for that emerging to light, I think would just be
that'd be a lot of fun.
Fantastic in
also,
the lore of this rivalry.
Speaking of 11 Warriors involvement, did you not notice Johnny Ginter's?
You told me one of your bylines was going to be in there, and I didn't notice not my byline. I think it was your "Notice Me Senpai" meme that you made. Was that right?
Yeah, that's what it was.
That's how you got into this.
Nobody, by the way,
so
I was
even
not
the Dubcast snuck into this documentary.
That's right.
If you noticed,
I was not contacted, by the way, by Netflix for my involvement in this, and I demand restitution. So I'm just saying, no, I don't care. So that was fun. That was interesting. I don't think anything actually come from it, but it was something we take a look at. Before we get out of here, I do want to kind of look at the national scene this weekend. There were some interesting games. A lot of people are talking about the Oregon game. Look, FCS Idaho rolls in to Eugene and is not intimidated at all. They're down by 3, I think, in the fourth quarter. Oregon pulls that one out, but man, interesting. Makes you think a little bit.
It was funny because as we were talking about pre-show, like you noted, Dylan Gabriel threw the ball. I think he was 41 for 49.
Yeah.
But only threw for 3.
It was 380, which is still a lot, but
but for 41 completions, that's an average of that's kind of what we were expecting from a high volume Will Howard passing attack.
Right.
So it's like, how much better would Gabriel have been as a get over Howard if Ohio State had actually, tried to fork over the NIL money?
I mean, I think he would have. I don't know how much he was demanding, but I still would have. He was the guy I really wanted. And actually, Cam Ward was another dude I was really high on, but apparently he
had a good weekend too.
He had a great weekend. Miami looked a lot better than 19th in the country. They did pretty well in acquitting themselves. A lot of other games. It was a fun weekend. I mean, the LSU USC game came down to the wire. That was a lot of fun to watch. I just like it when Brian Kelly loses. LSU.
You dislike it when Brian Kelly loses?
No, I like it when Brian Kelly loses.
Okay, you said dislike.
Oh, I did. Well, yeah. I enjoy it when he loses. It makes me happy because he's a bad person, and I like him being sad.
Yeah, between Lincoln Riley and Brian Kelly, that's one of those games where you're like, you know what? If a meteor hits the stadium, I think I'll be totally satisfied.
It's kind of wild how losing Alex Grinch instantly made their defense like 5,000 times better.
That's no secret to Ohio State fans.
No, I know it's not surprising, but it's just like
it's a continuation of the trend.
Yeah. And speaking of Alex Grinch, you go to Wisconsin. And they had a little bit of trouble with Ohio State's upcoming opponent. I wonder why that is, Mr. Grinch. No, I don't know. I don't think he was the sole reason for that. But they did eventually put him away, so that's fine.
They got bailed out by Western Michigan was winning in the fourth quarter of that game.
Yeah.
It's very, very funny that the play preceding the first jump around at Camp Randall with legal alcohol sales was a fake field goal that really goes for a touchdown for the other team.
That's right.
And then Western Michigan scores, and then they get a stop, and then their one freak bounce on a punt return that, tragically hits a Bronco in the shoulder pad. Mm-hmm. Wisconsin recovers. The momentum suddenly turns on its head because they're in scoring position. And they get in, and then Western Michigan isn't able to do the ball control game plan,
right?
Because they're playing from behind again in the fourth quarter that they had used to keep the game that close. If they've got a 1-point lead and don't turn the ball over on special teams in the fourth quarter of that game, they had all the momentum, and I think they were going to win.
It was close,
and that would have created a much different feeling, I think, for Ohio State fans generally going into this next game
Absolutely
than what we have right now. So the spread, I think, opened for this next game at 38.5. And it's like I said, a 30-point spread is a lot. A 40-point spread is irresponsible. 50 points is la-la land. And I think that 40 is too much based on what we saw from not only the very vanilla game plan that Ohio State ran against Akron, but also just how tough Western Michigan played Wisconsin in a raucous environment in their first game. So I would temper expectations relative to what this next game is going to be like for Ohio State. I don't think I would expect them to win by at least, 4 scores, but a nearly 40-point win, I think, is getting really, really out ahead of skis relative to what these two teams just demonstrated the last weekend.
I would agree with that. Like, absolutely. The last thing I want to say nationally, I got to talk about Michigan. Obviously, I rate threat level, all that stuff. I watch every Michigan game. I knew that their offense was going to be a train wreck. It was a train wreck. They declined to start Alex Orji because he can't throw the ball. I mean, the guy can't throw. He was a 50% passer in high school. It doesn't appear that he's improved all that much.
Johnny's spies in the lead up to that game released info saying that Orji was apparently not going to get the start.
No,
there was no confidence in him passing the ball, and he was extremely vindicated in those reports.
Yeah.
So,
well, and the thing is, so there were a lot of rumors on the Michigan boards about that, where it was just not going to happen, and then they ended up starting Davis Warren. Davis Warren is a guy who you can definitely, like, I think if you're Michigan, you can root for the guy. He had leukemia in high school. He had a COVID. I think was his senior. Somebody even seen this guy play. He couldn't play his senior year because of that. I think he was like a preferred walk-on at Michigan. So it's a cool story. And ostensibly I want a guy like that to be successful, but he wasn't it, man. I mean, he completed some of his, he was like 60% passer, which is fine. He had a bad interception, just trying to dink and dunk down the field, but their wide receivers are like possibly legit bad. Like that's something I think they need to like start thinking about and looking at.
Loveland, I know he plays tight end, but
he's their best receiver
that looks like a pretty legitimate receiving.
They shouldn't throw to anybody but him. It only
takes one really talented guy to open up opportunities for the rest.
They may only have
definitely got one in him.
They may only have one really talented guy because I think he'll be playing on Sundays, but everybody else looks pretty booty. But Donovan Edwards, trash. Like, I don't like the worst player to be on the cover of a video game. I don't know. I mean, he averaged 2.7 yards
Peyton
carry.
Hillis was on the cover of Madden 12.
Oh, that's true. I forgot about that.
Yeah, so.
That was rough. But anyway, Donovan Edwards did exactly the same thing he did last year, which was look bad against most opponents. I mean, he averaged like 2.5 yards a carry against Fresno State. Callum Mullings is much better. He's not great, I don't think. He had basically only one series where he was effective, but he was moving the chains that one series, and if they get more out of that guy, then that's a way forward. But honestly, I think they got to stop playing around with this quarterback rotation with Orji and Warren and just stick with Warren, run the crap out of Kello Mullings, throw to Colson Loveland 15 times a game, and that's it. And that's their offense. Their defense, their defense is really, really good through the starters. I think they have some weaknesses in coverage at linebacker and safety, but they just have no depth. And that's their biggest issue, is that towards the end of games, particularly if they're on the field a lot, which they're going to be because they're going to have to deal with a lot of 3-and-outs from their offense, they're going to get worn down. And it's going to be really hard for those guys to be on the field for as many snaps as they're going to be asked to be. So they tried to do some rotation with Will Johnson at corner, and every time he was out, they would just pick on dudes. And then even when he was in, sometimes they were picking on him. He had a game-sealing interception, which kind of, I think made people forget about a lot of the times that he got just like a night. Like there was one pass that Fresno State had where Will Johnson got cooked. I mean, he had no idea where he was on the field. And you got to believe if Fresno State can do that, a lot of other teams in the Big Ten can as well. So they got issues, and I'm excited to see how that plays out for the rest of the season. So.
I remain unconvinced in the imminent demise of the Wolverines, but I will say it was surprising to see them not consistently beat Fresno State on the line of scrimmage the way that they have the last 3 years.
So that was the other crazy thing.
There was one particular highlight where their center got absolutely like blown up on a 3rd and short running situation that stuck out to me particularly.
And they pulled him
hard.
immediately.
Yeah, I have to imagine that mistakes like that get rectified pretty quickly, just given the standard that program has set for itself. But against a team like Fresno State, particularly when the narrative coming out of the national championship was these West Coast teams can't compete in the trenches with the big boys of the Midwest.
Right.
To see that kind of struggle at the line of scrimmage was extremely surprising. Yeah. Given what this team is coming off of. But in any event, cheers to the Metal Gear Ginter tactical reconnaissance team for giving us the lowdown on a pretty accurate snapshot of Michigan to start the season.
What's the dog that he has in Metal Gear? That's me. That's who I am.
Diamond Dog.
Diamond Dog. That's me. I'm Diamond Dog Knight. No, I know it's Diamond Dog. It's whatever. Anyway. So, real quick, before we finish, just what's one thing you're looking for that you want to see out of this team against Western Michigan? What's something you want them to prove that they can do?
The only really point that I'm going to be scrutinizing the whole season is the offensive line.
Yeah.
Because if you're having a great game from them, then it just opens up everybody else to be successful. So I agree. I think Judkins... and we've talked about this before. I'm of the opinion that if you're the bare minimum for me to be successful as a running back is get 3.4 yards per carry, which is not good.
3.333 repeating yards per carry.
That means on average, if you're getting the ball 3 times, you're getting a first down.
Or 2.5 yards per carry.
I can live with that.
Yeah.
So I know that you're not thrilled with Judkins historically being this like 4 yards per carry runner.
Right.
But he's the type of running back, I think, that a lot of his success is going to be dictated by what kind of success the offensive line is having. So this unit, getting Donovan Jackson back hopefully next week, maybe he's still dinged up a little bit and they opt to continue resting him through this early stretch of not great competition relative to what's to come. But when this unit is fully healthy, I want to see the chemistry that they have. And if they're able to produce success for a guy like Judkins that is going to, based on what we just saw, be the volume-based runner that is going between the tackles, and how successful is that approach going to be for this team?
Yeah.
Or are they just going to have to rely on, getting just enough of a hole for a guy like Henderson to squeeze through and occasionally rip off a home run?
Right.
Because that's not going to be a conducive solution to long-term success.
Well, and that's the way it felt a lot of the time last year, right?
Right.
Like where it really did feel like that. And to your point, I think that if I'm looking for something, and I know I said this probably wasn't going to happen very often, this year, earlier in this podcast, but I want to see a 100-yard rusher. I want to see a guy go out, get 100 yards. I don't care who it is. I don't care if it's Henderson. I don't care if it's Judkins. I don't care if it's Howard. I don't care. I just want to see 100 yards. And then maybe just, make some teams.
What if it's Devin Brown?
That actually would be the funniest option. So yes, that is. I always tell people it's Ohio State and then funniest option. So if those two things are combined, then yes, I would be cool.
And we've seen Emeka Egbuka lead this team in rushing before, so let's not rule anything out.
All right, so I'm excited. Football's back. We had a lot of fun this weekend. We're gonna have a lot of fun next weekend, and we'll see you then next week to talk about all of it. So until then, I'm Johnny.
I'm George,
and we'll see you next time.
Take care, folks.